What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Nightblade tank. So I mentioned this previously in other build videos, but not much has changed between Dragonguard and Harrowstorm. That it is to be expected. Harrowstorm was not really marketed as a big rebalance patch. Of course, there were a few sets that were released, but none of them really met the standard for pretty much DPS, any of the three roles, DPS, healers, or tanks. So this build, I should say, a lot of the builds in Harrowstorm are going to be very similar to the builds that you saw last patch in Dragonguard, and Nightblade tanks are no different. They are still going to be one of the better tanks to run, right up there with Wardens and DKs, especially in places like Sunspire. They just received a lot of different buffs over the past few patches that have made them particularly very strong. Their main strength is they have a lot more mitigation than your average tank does, and they also have a couple of good utility moves as well. So Nightblade tanks are definitely in a very good place right now compared to where they were about a year ago. So just like the rest of our build videos, we won't be going over any sort of gear in this video. That's reserved for the gear video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what sort of gear you want to wear as a tank, feel free to go and check out that video and then come back here. This video will be talking about the skills and a little bit of a sort of surface view of how Nightblade tanks work, how they differ from your traditional DK tank, and so on. So let's go ahead and get started here with skills. So on our front bar, this is the sword and board line here. We have Ransack. Now, Nightblades do have a native source of minor protection, so we don't have to use the Ransack morph. We could use the other morph, which is Pierced Armor, which provides major breach. So it doesn't really matter which one you pick. Generally speaking, you will have another source of major breach active on a healer if you need major breach. If you are running all stamina DPS, obviously you don't need major breach, but if you do have magic DPS, typically speaking, you'll already have Ellie Drain from a healer, so Pierce Armor is a bit redundant, and you're already getting minor protection from a Nightblade source, so Ransack's also redundant, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose at this point. Next ability is Heroic Slash for the minor maim and the minor heroism, mostly for the minor heroism to get the additional ultimate so we can get our Warhorns up faster, but the minor maim is also very useful to help reduce incoming damage. Next we have our self-heal, which is Dark Cloak. This does scale off of our max health, and this is the source of minor protection that I was mentioning earlier. So you don't need to run Ransack because Dark Cloak already provides you with the minor protection. So it is active for 8 seconds. So one of the advantages of Ransack is if you don't want to run Dark Cloak every 8 seconds to maintain the minor protection, you can just use Ransack and that'll keep it up for 15 seconds instead. So it just lasts a bit longer in case you're not running Dark Cloak every 8 seconds, which is fairly intensive on your Magicka. Next we have Relentless Focus. You can go with the other morph if you prefer, which is Merciless Resolve. They both pretty much give you the same thing, which is 10% additional mitigation once you have 5 stacks, and you only need to activate it once. As long as you get the 5 stacks, you can let the buff fall off and you still maintain the additional damage mitigation. So you only really need to have it active for the start of the fight, and then you can just sort of like let it drop off. So it doesn't really matter which morph you choose, Relentless Focus or Merciless Resolve. If you do decide to use the bow proc, then Relentless Focus, generally speaking, will be a little bit stronger just because you will have more stamina and weapon damage compared to max Magicka and spell damage, but Merciless Resolve heals you for more, so kind of depends which one you want to go for there. Next we have a flex spot, but I am running Lotus Fan here. This is an AoE source of minor vulnerability, one of the only ways to get minor vulnerability out in an AoE. It's really great for trash fights. You can just hop into a big trash bowl and you apply minor vulnerability to everybody within 6 meters of where you decided to pop to. So really powerful for boss fights. It is also useful if you don't have a Warden healer for consistent minor vulnerability. It lasts for 10 seconds, so pretty nice utility move here, but if you do have a Warden healer and you already have made minor vulnerability from Petra Infection, you won't need to run Lotus Fan necessarily unless it's a trash fight. So this is arguably a flex spot here, so you can't swap this out for some other abilities. Then for our front bar, we are running Incapacitating Strike. This is not obviously going to be used. This is mainly for the Reeve passives, so we get 100 magic and stamina back when we deal damage with a light or heavy attack on an enemy with a negative effect active on them. The good thing is, Ransack and Heroic Slash, they both count as negative effects, so as long as you are light weaving, you will be able to get the additional magic and stamina return, which does help out your overall sustain, so it's nice to have that on here. For our back bar, this is your staff or your bow bar. We have our Inner Rage, which is our ranged taunt. We have Balance for Magic Sustain. It also provides us with Major Resolve. Now, Nightblades are a little bit unique in the fact that they don't have like an ability that just gives you Major Resolve. Their source of Major Resolve actually comes from a passive. More on that in a little bit towards the end of the video when we discuss how they differ from DK tanks. So, in order for consistent Major Resolve, you're going to want to run Balance, or you could run the Heavy Armor skill instead, which is Immovable, either morph. They all provide Major Resolve for much longer than what the Nightblade passive is able to provide for you, so you can pick whichever one you want. I personally like Balance because it provides us with additional magicka, which we do use quite a lot of, so we do want to make sure we have good magicka sustain, so we're running Balance here. Next we have Blockade of Storms. If you're running the Ice Staff, it's going to be Blockade of Frost, and if you're running the Bow, you should be running Endless Hail instead. This is just to help proc your enchants on your back bar. Next we have Leeching Strikes for additional stamina sustain. So this gives us stamina back whenever we deal a light attack, as well as a little bit of health. Plus we get a nice burst of stamina when the effect runs out. So this just helps us out with additional stamina sustain here. So really great. Just make sure you're light weaving in order to make the most use out of Leeching Strikes. Then finally we have Mirage, which gives us Major Evasion and Minor Resolve. So a lot of mitigation here for Nightblade. So the Major Resolve reduces damage from AoE attacks by 25%. And Minor Resolve gives a 1320 physical and spell resistance. The Major Evasion is huge, so a lot of damage that you're taking in trials and dungeons, they do count as AoE attacks, so they are affected by the 25% mitigation that you get from Major Evasion. So you have a lot of additional mitigation here as a Nightblade, because most other tanks, they don't have a class source of Major Evasion. They will need to find some other source of Major Evasion, things like Blade Cloak, or if they have 5 medium armor shuffle. So the fact that Nightblades are able to get Major Evasion just from a class ability is really, really strong. Then we have Aggressive Warhorn for the Major Force uptime. Now on our back bar here, if you don't need a stamina sustain, then you can drop Leeching Strikes. So this is kind of a flex spot depending on how well you are able to sustain your stamina. And then if you don't feel like you need the Major Evasion, then you don't need to run Mirage. I like it still because Major Evasion is pretty strong when it comes to mitigation, but if you feel like you don't necessarily need it, you might want to run a different ability, for example, you can swap this out here. So in terms of abilities, you might want to consider running here. Nothing really in the assassination line. There is niche case use for Reaper's Mark, which gives you Major Fracture and Major Breach. This is only place I've seen this used is going to be for Lachesty's. That's because the strategy for Lachesty's main tank is to actually stand far away and use defensive posture in order to reflect the ice bolts back at him, and since you're far away, you can't apply Major Breach, Major Fracture via your melee taunt, so you have to resort to Reaper's Mark instead. Note that Reaper's Mark does not apply a taunt, it just applies Major Fracture, Major Breach, so you will still need to have your ranged taunt in order to make sure you actually have the dragon taunted. But that's the only real case where you're going to be using Reaper's Mark there, when you have to stand far away at range, so you can't apply Major Fracture, Major Breach with your Sword and Board taunt. Under the Shadow line, you have another heal, which also heals your allies. So if you're running Symphony of Blades, for example, Refreshing Path is going to be a good way to help proc Symphony of Blades. The area is a little bit limiting, 17 meters by 7 meters, so it's kind of like a conal, so to speak. So a little bit tricky to kind of aim and doesn't necessarily hit people that are far away from you, but it's still a pretty decent heal nonetheless. Now, they did change how Fear operates compared to previous patches, so Fear will actually make enemies cower, so they'll stay in place rather than run away from you. This is a hard CC, so we do want to have Mass Hysteria here in case for trash pulls, so that way you can hard CC them in place. You don't have to necessarily worry about running something like Time Freeze anymore, because now Fear roots enemies. So definitely make sure to have Mass Hysteria here for those trash fights to hard CC things in place. Next, we do have Debilitate as a source of minor magic steal. Typically you'll be getting that from Ellie Drain, so not really something you'll be running very often. Also want to mention here, Power Extraction is helps reduce weapon and spell damage in trash fights, so just damage mitigation. That's always helpful to have on hand here. Sap Essence is also the other morph, which could be useful. It's also a heal. It's not a very strong heal because we're a tank, and it scales off of max magic and spell damage, but still a heal nonetheless, so you could still proc Symphony of Blades off of it. Both of these abilities would be used for trash fights, not boss fights, so just keep that in mind there. Moving on here to the sword and board line, we do have defensive stance and absorb missile, which can be useful if you know you're going to fight something that is using projectiles. Defensive stance reflects the direct damage projectile back at whatever cast it. Absorb missile will give you the heal, and they both provide you a damage shield as well, so they reduce the damage that you take from the projectile, not direct damage. So they're both useful in their own scenarios. I personally like defensive stance more than absorb missile because you also get some additional block mitigation through defensive stance, but it's up to you which one you want to get. I will point out you do want to know at the very least the base ability shield charge, because there is one fight in the game where you do need to have shield charge. That's the triplets in VHOF. So just for that single fight you do want to have shield charge. Doesn't really matter which morph you pick. Shielded Assault is probably the more tanky morph, so you might want to go with that instead. If you're running the Destro Staff line, make sure to pick up Crushing Shock because you might need a ranged interrupt. Ellie Drain would typically be covered by the healer, but you might want to pick it up anyways because it might be useful in 4-man content where you're running 1 tank 3 DPS. Or under the armor line, we already talked about Unstoppable. Just be mindful that both morphs do reduce your movement speed by at the very least 65%, so just keep that in mind before you use this ability. Once you use it, you're going to be very, very slow. You can still dodge roll and things like that, but your actual movement speed is going to be very, very limited, especially if you pick the immovable morph. Next, under the Sigic Order, actually no, under the Fighter's Guild line first, we have Ringer Preservation, which gives us a heal and minor protection. This is an AoE minor protection, so you can get it to other people. The heal is going to be very small because it does scale off over weapon damage, which is not as high as on a stamina DPS, but it's still a small heal nonetheless. Then Nightblades don't have a chain, or I should say a class source of chain, so you will need to run Silver Leash in order to pull enemies to you. So just be mindful that Silver Leash does use stamina, so you can only use it a limited number of times. You do want to conserve some stamina to make sure you're able to block heavy attacks that come in. There are some trash pulls where the heavy attacks can be fairly deadly. Now under the Sigic Order line, I do want to mention here Introspection and Deep Thoughts as another way to sustain magicka, stamina, and health without needing to resort to balance. The downside of running this ability is that it is a channeled, so you will not be able to block while you are restoring your resources. Now, you do have access to a passive called Deliberation, which gives you major protection, which reduces damage taken by 30% while you're channeling, but that's not the same amount of mitigation you'd get from blocking, so just be mindful if you do decide to use Meditate when to plan it out. You don't want to use it right when you're going to get hit by a very large heavy attack. You don't really need Temporal Guard because you have many sources of minor protection as a Nightblade, but that is an option there. Unlock all the abilities under the Adopted line. You have Overflowing Altar for the Minor Lifesteal and the Blood Feast synergy. Shadow Soak for the Black Widow synergy. Even though it is weaker, it's still essentially free damage. Just make sure to have that unlocked. Bone Surge for the Major Vitality synergy from the Spinal Surge synergy. You're not really using this for the damage shield, mainly because it uses stamina and you want to conserve stamina for blocking. But the Major Vitality is useful in certain scenarios where you want some additional healing received. Then we have Energy Orb, which is a fairly decent heal. It helps proc Symphony of Blades, plus it also provides the combustion synergy to your allies so they can get some more resources back as well. Capping things off with the Alliance War line, we have Echoing Vigor as a self-heal and another way to proc Symphony of Blades. It is an AoE heal. It does stack with other sources of Echoing Vigor, so really solid option here rather than running Resolving Vigor, because you can stack those multiple Echoing Vigors together to get even more healing done per second. Then on the support line, we have Efficient Purge if you need to remove negative effects from you and your group. So make sure to pick this skill up. And then we have Reviving Barrier. You can go with either morph, but Reviving Barrier is usually going to be a little bit better because it does have a heal over time while you have the shield up. So it's kind of up to you which morph you want to pick here. And then I do forgot to mention the two ultimates here. Bolstering Darkness, which gives you major protection. So this is a nice mitigation ultimate for progression style stuff. It also provides another synergy which gives anybody who activates it a nice heal over time. Then you have Soul Siphon, which is a nice burst heal, again for more progression style things. So not really used too much in score pushing for achievement runs, but for kind of progression guilds where you might need a little bit of burst heal, a little bit of major protection, you might want to consider running these two ultimates here on the front bar. But that pretty much covers it for all the skills. Now let's discuss tanking. Again, this is kind of like a very surface view of Nightblade tanking. I would recommend checking out a couple of content creators, whether that's on Twitch or on YouTube, to kind of get an idea of how Nightblade tanks work. I personally don't play a Nightblade tank. I typically tank on a DK, but I have played Nightblade tanks here and there. I just don't usually play one on a regular basis. So one of the big differences between Nightblade tanks and other tanks is the sheer amount of mitigation that you get. You have minor protection, major evasion, you have 10% unique, 10% mitigation from Relentless Focus or Merciless Resolve. So a lot of mitigation there that some other classes don't really have. The 10% additional mitigation you get from Merciless Resolve and Relentless Focus, that is unique to Nightblades. And then minor protection, while that's not a unique buff, you get it fairly easily. Just gotta pop yourself heal. Then major evasion is a little bit harder for other tanks to get, mainly because a lot of them have to run something like Blade Cloak, which necessitates running a dual wield on one of their bars. So you get that juicy mitigation that other tanks don't really have. So really solid mitigation tank here. Nightblades definitely are able to absorb a lot of incoming damage. Now your self-heal is not a burst heal. It is a fairly strong heal over those 8 seconds, so it does heal you for about a third of your health over the 8 seconds, but it is not a burst heal like Green Dragonblood is. So it does require you to kind of pay a little bit of attention to how much damage is incoming, so that way you have the healing you have your self-heal already ticking when you take that heavy hit. You definitely want to anticipate the damage incoming if you're playing a Nightblade tank, because you don't have the same sort of burst heal potential as, let's say, a Warden or DK. The other thing with Nightblade tanks is you have pretty much the only source of AoE minor vulnerability, which is really great for trash fights. For boss fights where it's only one target, not that big of a deal, because you typically will have a Warden healer running Fetch Infection, which is a pretty solid source of minor vulnerability. But having that option to have AoE minor vulnerability makes you very powerful in trash fights, where you can just apply it to everybody within 6 meters of where you jump to, and just get that additional damage on the entire group there. So one of the main weaknesses of Nightblade tanks is the fact that your self-heal is not burst, but that's sort of mitigated a little bit by the fact that you have so much damage mitigation. Generally speaking, the way that tanking works in ESO is you're more of a support role. Yes, you are a damage sponge. Yes, you're supposed to taunt things and make sure to stay alive the whole time, but your secondary job is to debuff the enemy and buff your allies. This can come from various amounts of different sources. So, for example, minor vulnerability is a debuff that you apply to enemies, and that comes from Lotus Fan. You have minor courage, for example, from the set Claw of Yolnahkriin. So, one of the things that separates out okay tanks from really great tanks is how well you're able to manage your buffs and debuffs. Once you learn a fight, once you're able to stay alive in a fight, you want to focus towards maximizing your buff and debuff uptimes. Things like your Crusher enchant on your backbar. If you're running the Alkosh set, maintaining your Alkosh debuff as long as you can. Those are the kind of things that separate out the good tanks from the great tanks. So as a Nightblade tank, obviously if you are the one responsible for minor vulnerability, make sure to have that active at all times. But like I mentioned earlier, the main strength of a Nightblade tank is the fact that you can eat a lot of damage. So a lot of your buffs and debuffs will be coming from your sets. So for example, I'm wearing Yolnahkriin, which is a fairly easy thing to remember. You should be maintaining taunt, so it's very easy to maintain minor courage. But let's say I'm running Alkosh, I want to pay attention to when my Alkosh debuff is going to run out, and make sure to grab a synergy to make sure that the debuff is always active no matter what, and time my synergies correctly so I don't necessarily have any downtime on that Alkosh debuff. But like I said, tanking is something that you should see rather than hear about, and while I don't play Nightblade tank myself, there are a couple of other content creators out there, Nephis for example, that do play Nightblade tanks more often than I do. So definitely check out those, whether that's on Twitch or on YouTube, to get a better idea of how Nightblade tanks work. I do have past streams where I have been a Dragon Knight tank, and the core concepts of tanking are pretty much identical between Nightblade and DK tanks. The only real difference is your abilities, which kind of dictates how you play a little bit, but the core concepts behind tanking, maintaining your buffs and debuffs and things like that, that remains the same across all classes, no matter what class you are. So even watching the DK tanking videos might give you a good idea of how you want to play a Nightblade tank. But that concludes this build video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.